Good afternoon. I'm Matt Burris, co-director of the Atlantic Council's New American Engagement Initiative. And the event we're having this afternoon is part of the series on future foreign policy. And today we are going to be looking at the global crisis in food security. Russia's war against Ukraine has led to a number of global consequences, none more dire than the effects being felt in the food markets. Not only has production and distribution of grain from Ukraine and Russia been significantly curtailed, the sharp rise in oil prices has also led to more expensive food and food production the world over. Food shortages pose severe danger for individuals as well as entire regions and geopolitical stability. We have many past examples of conflict and civil discord caused by high food prices and shortages. The global implications of a sustained food crisis would be severe as the developing world is left further behind and as wealthy countries are to keep their markets functioning. Earlier this month, I authored a policy brief in the New American Engagement Reframe series about the need for quick action by the United States and the West to provide debt relief and reform financial institutions in order to prevent significant loss in the developing world. The debt crisis obviously is aggravated by the food crisis. Failure to provide relief may well lead to rising populism and authoritarianism, extending the democratic backsliding already seen across the world. Today, we have with us three experts who I hope can provide us with ideas about how the crisis in food security can be addressed and the worst outcomes avoided. First, we have Dr. Arif Hussain, Chief Economist and Director of the Research, Assessments, and Monitoring Division of the UN's World Food Program. Dr. Hussain's work focuses on analyzing food security and welfare conditions in developing countries to inform the humanitarian response. Second, we have Ms. Dina Esposito. Ms. Esposito is Vice President of Technical Leadership at Mercy Corps, which is a humanitarian NGO operating in contexts undergoing various forms of economic, environmental, and political instabilities. Mercy Corps is a leader in understanding the intersection between economics and food crises and finding solutions to address such shortages. The third panelist is Dr. Joseph Glauber. Dr. Glauber is a senior fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, having previously worked more than 30 years at the US Department of Agriculture, including as chief economist from 2008 to 2014. He is an expert in understanding international agricultural markets, trade, and disaster policy. I hope that these three immensely qualified panelists will be able to give us a sense of the state of food distribution globally and give us insight into solutions that should be prioritized by policymakers. At the New American Engagement Initiative, our focus is on expanding the US toolkit to address not just traditional threats, but to confront emerging challenges and to enable greater global engagement with allies and partners. I think this conversation will hopefully do just that. With that, over to you, Emma Ashford, who is a senior fellow in the New American Engagement Initiative.
Great, thanks, Matt, for that great introduction. And I'm pleased to be moderating this conversation today with a panel of people with deep deep expertise in understanding global food security, food systems, and the relationship between development, security, and human security. And I think this is one of these big topics where that interaction between security and economics becomes so very important. For many of us here in the States, some of the primary effects of the war in Ukraine have been felt in sort of high gas prices or slightly higher food prices. But in some places in the world, this is truly a question of life or death, of famine, and of major disruptions. And of course, any crisis in economics always shows the weakest points in the existing system. So I thought I would just start by asking our panelists to talk for a few minutes about how they see the state of global food security at this point in time. Does this resemble other historical periods that we've passed through? Are there specific issues we should be paying attention to? Dina, if you don't mind, we'll come to you first.
Thanks, and I'm just really delighted to be here. I know that my economist friends will probably give you a much broader overview of the global food crisis. Mercy Corps has more of a bird's eye view. We're down at the local level working with communities in areas that are not only crisis affected, but conflict affected, and by which I mean conflict affected and often facing other forms of shocks. And the most conflict affected communities are also the most food insecure around the world today. I guess I would just start by saying I think we're in an unprecedented moment. I'll be interested in what my colleagues say. When I started leading the global humanitarian food assistance arm of USAID back in 2010, we were concerned about somewhere between 40 and 60 million people who were acutely hungry and need of food assistance. That number exceeds 139 million today. So just a dramatic increase, historic levels of people who are food insecure, historic levels of numbers of people who are displaced by conflict, and historic number of hotspots where we have famine watches or famine underway, which, I would say a decade ago, we would have said we had tamed famine for the most part, except in the most rare circumstances. So the fact that we have 8 or 10 places we're watching now is really a deep cause for concern. Ukraine is really just exacerbating what was already an acute crisis. We've been seeing the reversal of food insecurity globally since the around 2010, and that's due to the 3 C's, right? Conflict, major start of conflict with Yemen, South Sudan, Syria, Nigeria, and a number of conflicts that are driving hunger as first and foremost, the reason you see so many hungry people. A lot of those places are also facing climate shocks. It's remarkable when you look at the overlay: drought in Afghanistan, drought in the Horn of Africa, drought in the Sahel. This intersection of conflict and climate change is driving up the number of people who are hungry, and the frequency of those climate shocks is preventing people from recovering before the next shock hits. And then finally, you had COVID, of course, which had a huge economic hit on these same vulnerable communities. So it's all 3 of these before you even get to the Ukraine crisis. What does look familiar to me, what I would expect that we would see, are this triggering of social unrest back in the 2008-2009 food price crisis. We had something like 40 countries around the world seeing a rise in unrest and riots and that sort of thing. So I do think it's wise for the Atlantic Council to be looking at and considering the links between global food insecurity and the rise in conflict.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's go over to Joe, if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll come to Arif.
No, thanks, Emma. Yeah, I think I would agree with Dina. I think this crisis is a little different. Agricultural markets deal with drought and things like that every year, and sometimes they're severe. We saw price spikes in 2007-8, as Emma mentioned, 2010-11, and now we have the current situation. As Dina mentioned, markets were already tight. We had drawn down stocks. We had droughts last year. We've had other production disruptions, so that the stock situation coming in this year was already pretty tight. I think a lot of us thought, well, markets will respond, producers will plant. And we saw that in the fall that, that those prices would begin to moderate. But then on top of that, now you throw this war into the mix. And again, it's a war. We have wars all the time, but this is in an area where there's a lot of grain production. And so you're seeing the sort of price impacts that we've seen. I think the other big difference is that, unlike a drought where you might have a production shortfall one year, but normally you tend to think that, well, next year it will return to a more normal weather pattern and you'll have a rebound in production. Here, the uncertainty with what's going on in Ukraine, I think, right now there's some heroic efforts trying to get grain out of the country, but until those ports are really opened up on the Black Sea, it's going to be expensive one way or the other, regardless of what investments are made to move grain out through other avenues. And because of that, that means prices within Ukraine are going to be lower than they would be otherwise, which is a disincentive to produce. So my concern is not just this year, but very much going forward. We could see Ukraine production out of the picture for a while. And I think so that's, again, has caused the high degree of price uncertainty, the volatility that we've seen. And then I'll add the last one, and that's the fact that fertilizer is also involved in this mix. Both, I think, it was mentioned at the outset with high energy prices, but that means high natural gas prices, which means nitrogenous-based fertilizers have been at record levels, particularly in places like Europe. And then on top of that, you have other fertilizers like phosphorus-based fertilizers or potassium-based fertilizers, where Russia is a very large exporter, and as is Belarus. And because of that, there's real concerns because of the high import dependence in many areas around the world that those prices are going to be so high that some farmers aren't going to be able to apply, or they'll be making cropping decisions away from more nitrogen intensive crops. And so I think all of that is a lot of uncertainty in these markets right now. Thanks.
Thanks. Arif, would you care to weigh in on this question before we go to more discussion?
Sure. Thanks, Emma. Hello, everybody. Really happy to be here, although the topic is really tough. I think between Dina and Joe, most of the things are in fact said. I fully agree with what Joe said and what Dina said. Let me just put a few numbers behind it. One thing I've been saying is that this is obviously something which is not happening in a vacuum. We were already at a very bad state, meaning food prices were, before the war, food prices were already at a 10-year high. Fuel prices were already at a 7-year high. You have 56 countries right now around the world which are in debt distress or risk of debt distress. That number used to be about half in 2015. You still have lingering effects of COVID on the income side. So all that to say that this crisis couldn't have come at a worse time, basically. Now, when we, as at World Food Program, we are in the business of looking at acute hunger, and these numbers are just going through the roof. Just to put those in perspective, pre-COVID, we had about 135 million people who were in food security crisis or worse situation. Okay. Today, that number, our latest number, is 345 million. COVID effect had taken that number to 276, and then after that, this war added another. The rest of the people bring it to 345 million. Of this 345 million people, you have about 50 million, which we call are in IPC phase 4, meaning in emergencies, like one step away from famine. And there are about 850 some million people already in famine or catastrophe type conditions. That number used to be 1/10 of that only a couple of years ago. So when we are looking at all of this, out there, it's pretty bad. Now, the other question, which is which is troublesome and very simple to understand, is what is happening on the inflation side. Right now, there are about 40 countries where year-on-year inflation is upward of 15%, food inflation. And several of those countries are experiencing double-digit, triple-digit inflation. Then the second thing you look at is exchange rates. And what we are seeing is that currencies are falling left, right, and center. Again, 35 economies around the world have depreciated, their currencies have depreciated by upwards of 25% year on year. So just imagine a situation where inflation is up, currencies are tumbling. Countries where we work, most people, they spend upwards of 50, 60, 70% of their disposable income on food. What are they supposed to do? And whenever we are in this type of situation and we don't take care of that ASAP, we see some severe consequences out of that. One other thing I would say up front is unprecedented. Is this unprecedented? Frankly, I'm tired of using the word unprecedented. I didn't think we would ever use that after COVID. But here we are. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of comparing all what is happening right now to 2008 and 2011. And guess what? In 2008 and 2011, we didn't have COVID, right? Also, we didn't have a war in Yemen. We did not have a war in Syria. We didn't have a war in Ethiopia. We did not have a war in Nigeria. Even Afghanistan was stable. So dare I say that the world was much more stable in 8 and 11 than it is today. And even when you look at it from the climatic side, climate shock side, and you compare the first 10 years of this century to the next 10 years, what you're going to find is that the frequency and intensity of climatic shocks has increased in the last 10 years. So yeah, when we compare this situation, it is a lot worse than it was in 2008 and 2011. Stop here. Thank you.
Rather a grim picture, I'm afraid, but we appreciate the overview. Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions here. So, Joe, I was wondering if I could push you a little on your comment about sort of Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. And it seems to me, as somebody who doesn't know this topic at all, that the issue right now is transporting grain out of Ukraine, but that won't be the issue in 6 months or a year. In 6 months or a year, if Ukrainians haven't planted, then the issue will be alternative supplies. And I guess I'm just curious, how you see this problem developing in the long run. Is this going to continue to be a situation where we're focused on Ukraine, or will the focus shift elsewhere in the long run?
Well, yeah, I guess I wouldn't distinguish the two if I understood your question correctly. But let me first address Ukraine. Yes, obviously the problem is ultimately moving grain out of the country because it's a large exporter. Right now, most estimates are that storage capacity within the country, particularly within the unoccupied areas, is going to be exhausted before the fall crops come in. There are already somewhere along the lines of 20 million tons in the country that normally would have been shipped out by this time that haven't been able to. At peak months, Ukraine typically ships 5 to 6 million tons. At best right now, we've been in the 1.5 to 2 million tons. There are some who are more optimistic that more grain can be shipped out overland. But frankly, that comes at a huge cost. I mean, the costs are quadruple that of moving out through the Black Sea. So while it's a very good short-run solution to help move that grain out, get it to the world markets, and also clear out storage space so farmers can store the wheat crop that is currently being harvested, and then the maize, barley, and other crops that are going to be harvested in the fall. In the near term, it's a very real issue. But in the long run, those ports have to reopen for Ukraine to remain a viable exporter. They're not going to continue to be a large exporter of grains by shipping out through the Baltic Sea or by rail to the Danube down to Constanta. I mean, those are all, again, great short-term fixes, but they're not long-term solutions. So normalization is really the key thing here. And I think that's in the meantime, the world has to supply what it can. And you are seeing some areas, unfortunately, because this came in after the winter wheat crop was harvested, the Northern Hemisphere fall planted wheat can't really respond until this fall. But we have seen spring planted wheat, certainly in Canada. It looks like we'll have larger production this year. Hopefully we'll see another good Southern Hemisphere crop, although they've had 2 good crops in a row, and hopefully they'll have a third here. But it's just going to take time, I think. And in the meantime, you still have this uncertainty about Ukraine. And so if you were to tell me the war is over tomorrow, I'd still think that it would be a while for the markets to get back to pre-war levels. But again, until that war ends, you're always going to have that sort of hole to fill to make up for the loss of Ukraine grain.
Dina, your organization is sort of on the ground focusing on these issues. And, I wonder if I could just ask you to talk a little bit about some of the effects that you've actually seen from the war in Ukraine. We've had a war in a country that's not just a major grain exporter, but is in some ways a source of food aid for other countries. And then we have this phenomenon of a lot of aid flowing into Ukraine that's perhaps being diverted from other places. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little to what your organization is seeing in terms of those dynamics.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I would start with that last comment you just made. One of the effects of the war in Russia's war on Ukraine is this diversion of attention from other global crises. And so Mercy Corps, as an organization working in many of the most food insecure and conflict-ridden places in the world, has had money diverted. Donor commitments are suddenly no longer there in places like Colombia, even Yemen, parts of the Horn of Africa and Myanmar, where we suddenly did not have the resources we expected to get because donors are signaling that they want to move that money into the Ukraine response. The other effects is, as Ari pointed out, it's driving up the cost of doing business. And so an unintended consequence is just that we have less money to support larger numbers of people because the cost of fuel and all the things that we need to do is really hurting our ability to respond. And then, of course, one of the major dimensions of the global humanitarian response are cash transfers to vulnerable populations. This is if I could call it an innovation in the relief world in the last decade, which is a really important way of sustaining markets while sustaining people's lives and livelihoods. Suddenly, the amount of the transfer we're giving no longer covers the amount of the food basket people need to buy. This is going to be a major conversation, I think, for the global humanitarian community. Do we plus up those dollar values so people can buy more food and feed their families, or do we just if we do that, then we're feeding fewer people or reaching fewer people. So I think that's a major dilemma. In terms of the hard choices people make, I mean, we know that on the sort of simpler side, people skip meals, right? They have to reduce the amount they eat. We see kids being pulled out of school so that they can help their families earn incomes. We see early child marriage. We see the selling off of assets. And, things are really bad when people start migrating. You have millions of people who are migrating across the Horn of Africa in search of food and water. And that's when it gets really, really tough, because then you got to do shelter, you have overcrowding, you have big nutrition challenges. I was just in the northeast area of Nigeria in a very small enclave, Boko Haram all around, the government of Nigeria protecting this town. And WFP has cut the rations in half. And these families cannot farm, right? I heard the story just before arriving of 2 suicides, one attempted, one accomplished suicide by widows with 10 children to care for, who simply were at wit's end. They had no real other alternatives. They didn't know how they were going to cope. And so when we talk about negative coping mechanisms, we're talking about some pretty really, really serious and devastating effects. And the war in Ukraine is having knock-on effects globally, which are not visible. The people are not looking at the historic drought in the Horn of Africa, where you've got 23 million people in need of food assistance, massive migration. The Sahel, the same. We could talk about Afghanistan, but so the knock-on effects are very real.
Yeah, this is, I mean, again, incredibly grim. And perhaps, Arif, I might direct this question to you. The numbers that you gave were staggering in your opening remarks. And I was wondering, where are these effects being most seen? Obviously, Dina mentioned the Horn of Africa here, but where else are you concerned about? Yemen has been this ongoing problem, but you mentioned, I think it was 8 or 10 different places that might be facing famine. Where are you most concerned about?
So let me pick up where Dina left. It's interesting that when WFP is setting records in terms of number of people reached, it doesn't speak well for the world. And what we have been doing since 2020, we have been doing just that. In 2020, we assisted about 116 million people. Okay, highest in our 60+ year history. 2021, 128 million. This year, 152 million. Okay, and the price tag for that is upwards of $22 billion. We are about, we think right now our numbers show that we have about 50% or less of that secured. That means that we have to cut rations. We are cutting rations in so many places, like Yemen, like South Sudan, like Afghanistan, like Central African Republic. I can keep going. I mean, there's no place where we are giving what is needed. It's ration cuts of upwards of 50%. Okay. The problem is that because of COVID and everything, people are so beaten up that there's no coping left. So when we don't do, this is why you're starting to see mass displacements of people. This is why people are moving. This is how destabilization starts. This is how terrorism starts. This is how mass migration starts, because there are no choices left. And we have been in that category before, and we are in that category right now. But this is not the worst of all. Because right now what we are saying is that this is an affordability crisis. If you have money, food is there. It can get to wherever you want it, provided you have money, right? It's just more expensive. Why? Because if it's not coming from Ukraine, you can go to Canada, you can go to Australia, you can go to Argentina. But it's going to cost you more in freight, and it's going to cost you more in time. But it's there, right? So if you help the governments, like Joe was saying, deal with the debt, but I would say also help with facilities for purchase of food, fuel, and fertilizer, maybe we can get out of this. And if the war ends soon, maybe we can be back on track quite fast. But that doesn't look like it's happening. So if that is the case, and we are not able to deal with our fertilizer issue and with our agricultural input issues, then for the next season, this affordability crisis of now turns into availability crisis of tomorrow. And I don't want to say what that would do. And this is not all, oh my God, what is happening? I mean, look at how people are dealing with things in Western countries, in rich countries, because of inflation. Look at food insecurity in the US. Look at food insecurity in the UK. Then you compare the countries where we work and say, it's no surprise that things are as bad as they are. And this is why we need to sort this out, because when we don't, we end up paying 1,000 times more. Don't take my word. Look at Syria in Europe. look at Central America, and US, look at Sahel in Europe. And like Dina is saying, if people are moving, where do you think they're going? First to the urban areas, and there, what is there? And then the next stop, So this is what the reality is out there as we speak. I was just in Sahel. I'm really, really concerned about the Horn. It reminds me, Dina knows this. I mean, it reminds me to what we are seeing over there. It reminds me of things in 2011. And we missed the boat on that one. We don't want to miss another boat.
250,000 deaths, more or less, 2011 in Somalia alone.
Wow. And I think that affordability versus availability problem is a really interesting and important one that I'm not sure many policymakers have grasped. The difference between you can solve the problem with money if you really have to, and being simply unable because there's not enough to go around. So, I mean, I guess let me ask you about the typical donor countries here. How are countries responding to this crisis, particularly the ones that are usually involved on the donor side? Are policymakers taking this seriously? It sounds from what you're saying like they're not taking it seriously enough. But I'm curious what you're hearing about potential responses here. And, open this up to anyone that wants to answer.
Can I start
Please.
on that? No, I just wanted to say, no, many countries are taking this seriously, and others are not. What I mean by that is, if you look at the US, the $40 billion allocation for Ukraine, that is $5 billion for global food security. That is something which should be appreciated. Now the point is how quickly we can get that money into the hands of people who need it. That's the second part of that. Look at Germany; they put in about $4 billion more. Even UK, I think it's 1 billion and change over 3 years, but more is coming. But that's not the end of the world, I mean, there are other countries, there are Gulf countries, there are who should be in this as well, and they're not at the moment. I think that's something which needs to be encouraged. So, having said that, I think the needs by far outweigh the resources available, right? So this is the time not only for the governments, but also for others, whether it be private sector, whether it be the billionaires, whether it be individuals, to step up. Because frankly, I mean, this is the crisis of our lifetimes.
I think somebody alluded to this earlier, but we all thought COVID was the crisis of our lifetimes, and it just keeps, everything just keeps rolling along. Joe, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, and I'll first start with COVID. I think the thing, and this has been mentioned by both speakers, I think, but remember, countries spent a lot of money trying to address COVID, and so they've built up debt levels. So the idea that there's a lot of cash out there for particularly poor countries to do things. I mean, we looked at the import bill for Yemen alone. I think it went up 4% of their GDP, just with the wheat price increases. I mean, they're a poor country, obviously. They're highly dependent on humanitarian aid. But that means that someone has to pony up that money and come forward. And I think it is, I agree. I think that just focusing on the US for a moment, I think it is really important that they've come forward with a big aid package. Unfortunately, a lot of the aid programs, food aid programs with the US, however, are tied to requirements that they ship them on US ships. They have to buy US grain. All of that adds costs. And I think that my preference certainly would be, let's get it in the hands of the humanitarian organizations who can source grain from the cheapest place possible, get it in the fastest way possible, and deliver it to those in need. But that's not, it's not a criticism in the main. I think the fact that we are political realities are political realities, and to do it through these programs may be the only way to get that sort of agreement from Congress. But I think it's good that at least some countries are stepping forward.
I would just add one more comment to that, and that is the lateness of the response, not vis-a-vis Ukraine, but vis-a-vis these droughts that have been really, there's been long warning about the acute drought in the Horn of Africa, 4 consecutive growing seasons. That's a lot of warning, and we are incredibly late, even with the new money. We were able to avert massive, outcomes from the huge drought in 2015, 2016, because the global community came together early and there was no famine in the Horn. There was no story to report. But this year, despite all the early warnings, that just the amount of stuff going on in the universe, there wasn't the response that we might have expected in terms of timeliness. And then I would just point out that, yes, I agree that really, really important for the United States to have stepped up in such a big way with the $5 billion. That's not just relief, but also includes some money for long-term recovery, which is important. But I was told recently that, the Somalia, there's famine ongoing in pockets of Somalia today. That appeal is 20% funded, and 90% of that money is from the United States. Now, I would point out that the Ukraine appeal is about oversubscribed probably, but was 97% funded within 3 days of being launched. So you've got this extraordinary inequity in the donor response and their understanding, or, there's just an extraordinary inequity there that I think we need to call attention to.
Yeah, and it's funny. This is the problem you hear about charities confronting on a domestic level too. That people give lots of money for high-profile events, but not necessarily for consistent low-level response. So perhaps this provides us an opportunity to pivot to a few bigger questions before we move to the Q&A. And if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A function here, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. Let me start with you, Arif. You recently wrote a piece for the U.S. Institute of Peace, which talks about the long-term economic benefits of increasing food aid in the short term. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little about that, and if your fellow panelists would be interested in talking about areas where long-term reform of the sort of global food security institutions, or a response to these things could be helpful going forward.
Yeah, so I'm of the school of thought that it's almost, on one side, it's almost common sense that if you're suffering from a war, right, and you're getting assistance because you are in a situation of war, why should your situation change from year to year if the war continues? Right. By definition, you get weaker and weaker and weaker because, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And now if you look around and you see all of these wars, there are, Yemen is 8 years, Syria is 11 years, South Sudan has never seen peace in the last 10, 11 years, Northeast is 7, 8. I can keep going on that. So first and foremost, it is about getting to the root cause, end the wars. Why? Because if you're not going to do it for those people, do it for yourselves, because the calculus of war has changed. War has become much more expensive, and it is no longer an issue of, it's somebody else's problem. It has become a common problem. And I think that is where we need to start thinking about policy. The second thing, which for me kind of links to this, is that we have a tendency to, when we're in a shock like this, whether it was 8 or 11, we talk about things. Oh, this must happen and this must happen, and we must have our diversified exports and all of that. And then the shock goes away and we go back to sleep till the next shock. And what we are saying is that this time around, maybe countries do need to think about their agricultural policies and their energy policies, not only because of the environmental issues, but more so from the economic security and national security point of view. Let me just say that, arguably, if EU was not as dependent as it is on Russian gas, maybe this war wouldn't have happened. So one thing is dealing with these issues and the initiatives which are starting, whether it's Farm Initiative, whether it's G7 initiative, whether something, that those initiatives are not going to be done in months, they're going to be done in years. But this war hopefully will be over in months, so we don't stop. That's one. The second thing we are saying is that, you know what, our investment portfolios are diversified. You don't only buy one stock or one, asset category in terms of your investments, you diversify. When you look at your food security, less than 10 countries hold 90% of your exports of wheat, rice, corn, soybean. Less than 5 hold stocks at the same level of these. So our individual portfolios, we diversify them, but global portfolio of food security, that's not diversified. And by the way, this is not a new problem. This was back there in 2008 and 11. So maybe third time is the charm, and we actually go and sort these out. This is what I was trying to say in the U.S. Institute of Peace paper.
Great, thanks. Joe, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll probably take a little more nuanced answer on that, at least on this latter part. I think it is really important. There are a lot of countries that have big gaps in their productivity between what they could actually produce and what they currently produce. So I think there's a lot of improvements in productivity that need to happen. This has been agriculture, unfortunately, has had this traditional underinvestment that we thought we were going to start addressing it back in 2007-8, following the food price crisis then, but it needs more work. And I think that there I'm in complete agreement. I do caution, however, that it's easy to say, let's have a diversified portfolio, but remember, like any insurance, there's a cost to that. And you got to remember that Black Sea wheat is the cheapest, if you're sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's the cheapest place to get wheat. And I don't think you're necessarily going to hold 30 or 40% of your market or your imports. You think, well, I'm going to get that from Australia because I want a diversified portfolio, because that's going to cost. And I'm not saying Arif is arguing that point, but I think that it's just that you got to look at any strategy like that from what the costs are and the benefits. And I think that countries have droughts all the time. Does that mean you shouldn't depend on that country for imports, or even going down the road of self-sufficiency? Because I mean, look at a country like Morocco, who they normally import a certain amount. This year they had a devastating drought, and they need very much to import grain. And that means, to have markets out there that are supplying grain to the world. I think the one good thing aspect of this current crisis is that the markets actually are performing pretty well. That is, people are able to source grain. Again, we've talked about the affordability versus availability issue, but I think that's something too. The third element I would add here is flexibility, and that's what you're seeing with buyers in Egypt and other places that are turning rapidly to other potential suppliers. And as long as that's functioning, I have less concerns over the long run. But again, just the main point that even diversification strategies, you got to look at the full costs and benefits of those.
That's such a great point. From my own point of view, I do a lot of work on energy. One of the reasons why the European Union is having so many energy problems now is that exact reason. When there's a crisis, it's too late to change course, and before the crisis, it's too expensive and no one does it. So there's this real catch-22. Before we move on to Q&A, Dina, I just wanted to offer you the chance to respond here. If you had a magic wand and could change something structurally about global food security, what should we focus on?
Yeah. I guess I'm maybe take it back to the program level a little bit more, and both in the relief and development side of things. For me, I think Mercy Corps is a multi-mandate organization. We don't think that communities in fragile, conflict, food insecure places can get by just with an ag approach or just with a relief approach. That we need to blend our humanitarian assistance with economic recovery, and recognize that people in vulnerable settings are economic actors who are going to rely far more on markets than they're going to rely on humanitarian aid workers. And I don't think we think enough about how can we use whatever dollar you want to call it, relief or development, to really help themselves through investment grants for small businesses, or to take money and give it to businesses, which is sort of anathema in the relief world. Well, you have to help the starving person. But if you know that fundamentally those businesses, if they're open, are going to employ people and provide goods and services. And I think particularly in this crisis where you're going to see inflation going up, that we want to provide grants to small businesses to help defray their costs and keep their businesses open, just as we did in the United States and which other developing countries do. We need to expand our mind to think a little bit differently about what smart relief looks like. So I would love to see more of a blending approach, and to let people speak a little bit more openly about moving outside of the household level and into the systems level, even in these really fragile and context and conflict affected places. I think that also we are working a lot with the households in these areas to go local, the global supply chains. I mean, I know it's not, it's inefficient, right, to put your investments and put people who are not going to be necessarily providing the world's food supply. But from a survival and risk reduction point of view, it makes a hell of a lot of sense, right? We're working with, Arno Farms in Northeast Nigeria to provide a breed of poultry to displaced women that are easier to care for, that's boosting their income and improving their nutrition simultaneously. Would a relief actor give us money to provide poultry to women in displaced women in Nigeria? If people, so that would be my hope, that people could expand their minds a little bit. We have tried to launch ag recovery programs in Northeast Syria. Those funds have been cut because there's just not enough money in the system to provide that from a humanitarian perspective. So I just think we need to be more multidisciplinary and think a lot more expansively about how we can help households both improve their own on-farm production as well as sell food in their local market. So really going local with our ag production work in these places that are on year relief is something I would love to see.
Great, thanks. Well, I'd like to pivot us to our Q&A because I think there's some great questions in the chat function already. And let me start with this question that just came in from Lindsay Iverson, who says, during the 2008 crisis, we saw a number of important countries restrict food exports for political reasons. Are we seeing a repeat of that in today's crisis, or have there been any changes in global institutions that have reduced countries' tendency to clamp down on exports in situations like these? And I'll just open these up to anyone who wants to respond.
I think Joe wants to.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do so. My organization, IFRI, we do one thing we have is an export restriction tracker, and so we look at how much food is being affected by various sorts of export restrictions and compare that to previous periods where export restrictions were used. So we looked at 2007-8, we've also looked at COVID, and during the current crisis, you have about 17% of agricultural trade, at least calculated on a kilocalorie basis, that's being affected by export restrictions, and they vary between out and out bans or export taxes and other things. One of the largest restrictions right now is the fact that Russia actually has an export tax on its wheat. So if you're purchasing wheat from Russia, you're paying an additional 25% tax, essentially. And that was in place before the invasion. Again, not an out and out ban, but it is a cost to importing from that country. India announced in a fairly widely publicized announcement a few weeks ago that was going to ban wheat exports. In fact, that turns out to be a little softer than what it first appeared, in the sense that they're still going to approve some government transactions. They've promised to send some to Bangladesh, for example, and they're also honoring any sales that had been made. So they at one point had talked about maybe exporting as much as 10 million tons of wheat this year, which would have been a big help, obviously. But it looks like it will probably be closer to 4 or 5 now, which is still substantial. And I might add, above what was projected at the beginning of the year. So export restrictions can be very bad for, can just exacerbate price volatility. I think that's the one big lesson from 2007-8 and 2010-11, and then even during COVID. And hopefully countries won't do that, because once one country does, oftentimes you see other countries implementing those things. And moreover, it not only raises prices for everyone else in the world, it penalizes producers within that country. And if you look at, say, a country like Argentina, which had several years of export restrictions on wheat, the net result of that was that wheat production fell in those countries over time. And so that's a real concern.
Just on that, to follow Joe, we continue to say that it's bad policy to put on export bans. Concerned about palm oil, Indonesia, that's a very big issue for us. On the other side, I mean, there are about 23, 24 countries which have some sort of a ban right now, and Joe is absolutely right. Because it's not only the ban itself, it's the copycat effect of that. And two things there. One, it doesn't help anybody. Prices rise, but inside prices get depressed, or transaction cost goes up because there's so much leakage. So either way you cut it, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so we have another question, an anonymous question here, which asks, sort of at the personal level, are there any short-term measures that people living in affluent countries can take to help in this time of crisis? Should we be taking steps to reduce our consumption to free up supply? So I think that's well below the level of policy, but a lot of people probably wondering it.
I think one thing I would point to is just the fact that this is a long-term crisis. It's not going away. And to the extent that this is somebody in America who wants to call their congressperson to make sure that next fiscal year budget is equally generous. We had the $5 billion in the Ukraine appeal, but this is a multi-year challenge, and the numbers are just so out of whack between, not just on the relief side, but we need, I think in the US, a recommitment to the Global Hunger Initiative that was launched, back in 2010. Those resources have been flat for over a decade. Prices have gone up. The urgency is only more clear. So I would really call for an advocacy, urging their politicians to get involved and to care about the knock-on global effects of the hunger crisis would be one action.
That's great. And then perhaps we could also pick up this question from Howard Lavranchi in the Q&A. He asks, the G7 are going to take up the question of food insecurity in the coming days when they meet in Bavaria. Can we expect anything meaningful out of the summit? And, what could global powers like the G7 most effectively do?
Well, I would say they are trying to address a few things. I think the humanitarian aid is a very big part of it, and I think that to get any sort of coordinated effort there out of the G7 would be excellent. The other thing, there is a big push by the G7 to try to free up or to improve transporting grain out of Ukraine, and I think that both in terms of overland, so-called brown corridors, or a more concerted effort to open up the ports. Those really would be great. I don't have much hope for the opening up the ports, but in the near term at least. But I think the G7 is locked on trying to do something for Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, on that, basically what we are asking for out of G7 is just that not only that the port should be open up, but that it shouldn't be for WFP 1 million ton or 2 million tons. It has to be about commercial trade. It has to be about essential commodities commercially, because that's what will make a dent in the prices, not humanitarian WFP. That for us is one of the biggest points. The second one, I mean, we are asking of G7 to basically, on the humanitarian side, like I was saying earlier, give and give generously till these issues are sorted out, and don't. There is an urgency to this because agriculture takes time, production takes time, change takes time, and that is a significant issue. So we are pushing for that. One thing you may not know, but which is again the positive, is that after many years, WTO members finally agreed to exempt WFP from export prohibition and export restrictions for humanitarian commodities as food. That you would think would be something very simple. It took upwards of many years and a lot of hard work, but finally was done. So I think we need to appreciate that. On very last thing I wanted to say was on what can you do as an individual, and this is something which is in Europe, very close, because our energy bills are through the roof, whether you're in Italy or elsewhere. And basically, I mean, for me, I was like, it may sound funny to you, I said, you know what, I'm going to stop taking hot showers, or very short showers, because that's how you save energy. The other thing, food waste. Let's not say, what people say. It's like, buy less, buy often. Those are the things which we as individuals can do, can do. And by the way, I mean, if it is done in high numbers as individuals, it does make a dent. I'm the person who thinks if you really truly want to make a change, and it is from the demand side, it is from the consumer behavior side, not from the supply side. So yeah.
Yeah, and this is such a good point, again, on the energy side, which we've not really had time here to get into the interactions between the energy crisis and the food crisis, but it's kind of amazing to me that Western governments aren't pushing conservation more aggressively, because that is a way that we could help to actually sort of reduce energy demand, mitigate the crisis somewhat. Let me ask one final question here. We've got 2 minutes, we'll sneak it in, because I think it's very interesting. Jamil Khan asks, in this crisis, what is the contribution of China, the rising superpower? Joe, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I think as far as agriculture, you've got to remember that China's the largest importer in the world. They are the #1 agricultural importer. People talk about the levels of stocks that China holds, and certainly by all the major organizations that do those estimates, like FAO or USDA or the International Grains Council, they all show very high stocks, wheat stocks for China. But those stocks do not make it into world markets. And in fact, the quality of those stocks is very much in doubt. This year or last year, China imported 10 million tons of wheat. They're likely to import another 10 million tons this year. So I don't think that this is something that we're going to see. China has just announced more imports of rice. They have a very large feed industry of, feeding livestock, all of that. I don't think that they aren't seen as a large agricultural exporter, is my point out of all this. They are a large exporter of non-agricultural products for sure, but not so much agriculture.
Fascinating. Please go ahead.
No, this is something which really worries me. In fact, what Joe just said, because when you look at the stocks holdings, I mean, China is the biggest holder of stocks. I mean, wheat, I think, Joe, it's about 50%. Corn is 30 some, rice is, I think, 77 some percent of the global stocks are there, but their Chinese stocks are not necessarily global stock reserves. So what that means is that our stock to use ratios in real sense are way lower than we show. And that is why, I mean, I'll take you back to what I was saying earlier. That is why we are really worried that this affordability crisis does not turn into availability crisis, because our stock to use ratios outside of China are extremely low. That is something people need to really truly understand the significance of that.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, but I do want to thank all our panelists for such an enlightening discussion on a really important issue that I think is increasingly noticed, but has been flying under the radar for a while and has implications for security. So thank you to you all, and thanks to your organizations, three great organizations, Mercy Corps, IFPRI, and the World Food Programme, which are all working to try and mitigate this crisis. And thank you to everybody at home for joining us. We hope to see you at our next Future Foreign Policy event in July.
Thank you.